Well, hello. My name is Kendall Svengalis. I'm a member of the Greater Education Council of Connecticut, and I'm the former Rhode Island State Law Librarian, and I have had an interest in climate change probably from about 1988. It actually arose when my brother came to visit, and I lived along the shoreline in Rhode Island. And my brother, who was a little bit of an alarmist type about a variety of things, said, you know what, aren't you concerned about climate change? The oceans are going to flood your house. And so that comment just kind of set me off, on studying the whole idea of climate change. And I started reading and observing things. And so that's what got me interested. So I've been reading about it for probably 30, over 30 years. But with us today, I have a real scientific expert. And his name is Lawrence Gould, goes by Larry. He taught at the University of Hartford. He is a professor emeritus now. And he was gracious enough to agree to speak with us about climate change, because I've been very impressed with Larry's writings and his views on climate change. He's a climate realist. He understands the science. And so I'll just give you a little bit of background about him. He earned his BS in physics from Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. He earned his MA and PhD in physics from Temple University. He's given over 70 talks, many of them in Europe. If you go through his resume, it's very impressive. And on climate alarmism, which he refers to as AGWA, or anthropogenic global warming alarmism. And so Larry, first I'd like to ask you, how did you get involved in the issue of climate alarmism or climate?
Well, it goes back over 20 years to about 2004. And it turns out that I was the chair of the New England section of the American Physical Society at that time. And that's when I first started hearing about dangerous global warming. And my concern was, well, that's what I hear, but there have been exaggerations from time to time in the news. So I was wondering whether it was true. And so with the assent of the New England section of the American Physical Society and the New England section of the American Association of Physics Teachers, we had a full meeting at Pratt & Whitney in East Hartford devoted to what they call it now is climate change. They used to call it global warming. And I got 4 speakers. The original 2 that I had refused to come when they found out that the other 2 that I had on the program, the other 2 that I had on the program, and they did come. One was Richard Lindzen, who is now Professor Emeritus from MIT. And the other is John Christie in Alabama. And he's given a number of congressional testimonies. So it wasn't really a debate, but you could hear from the different positions that some contradicted the other. So that was how I got into it. And then I continued reading about it. I read books. There was one book by Christopher Essex and McKittrick, I think, and it was called The Climate It wasn't Unstoppable Global Warming. It was something about the politics and the actualities of climate change. And they go into it in a way, McKittrick and Essex, they go into it in a way which is pretty clear to the intelligent lay people. What I mean by intelligent lay people is you really have to think about what they say and ask yourself what it means in your own terms. And then it becomes clearer. I had to do the same thing. It wasn't obvious to me what they were saying, but then I kept rereading, and then I understood. I tried to get them to, and I still want to have them publish it as a Dover edition. I don't know where that stands at the moment. So I've been on various committees too. There's an institute called the Heartland Institute, and I'm one of their academic advisors. And then in the CO2 Coalition, I'm on a board of advisors, and the Global Warming Policy Foundation, I'm on their board of advisors. I don't know quite the title, and then I look at their websites, and I've seen things by them, but also by other people who have pointed out the discrepancy between what the claims are and what the facts are. And I would from time to time go down to Yale when I saw that there was going to be a speaker on global warming, because then I knew there was a question and answer session, and I could ask my questions. And one of the problems is the claim of dangerous global warming, and there's a graph of over 70 graphs, and they're all going up. They sort of wiggle and they go up, and so the plot is time on the horizontal axis and temperature on the vertical. So the temperature is increasing with time according to the graphs. Now, according to the radiosonde, which is the balloons which measure the temperature and pressure and humidity as the balloon goes up, and according to the satellite measurements, which took place from around 1979, the line that you see in temperature versus time is practically flat. So on the one hand, you have the claim that the temperature is going to be horribly increasing, and on the other hand, you have, but the observations show that the temperature is actually flat over the period. Now, the other problem is that there are people who have pointed out that there's been a manipulation of data. And one of the guys who has a website, and one can check that out, he's gone into the literature, he's gone into newspapers of the past, is Tony Heller, Heller. And he's pointed out that when you see some of the claims where the temperature is increasing, they show you that, but they don't show you that the temperature has actually decreased, and then it's increasing. And the temperature over millennia, over millions of years, has fluctuated. In fact, over the past couple of million years, in the ice ages, which took place about 100,000 years, they started about 100,000 years from each other. The temperatures have gone decreasing quite significantly. So my problem was once I got into this, reading the literature, reading the observations and the claims, is that people claim one thing, and the news media mostly are claiming one thing, including the front page of the New York Times, but the observations show you something else. And one of the things, if you want to cut in.
It's okay.
But I was going to comment on the methodology. I'm interested in philosophy, and I wondered when people make statements about the temperature is going to do this, or the hurricanes are going to do that. I wondered, do they actually know that based on reading the scientific data and reports, or are they really claiming that without knowledge? Now, I've actually thought about that because there are people who make claims, but actually just believe what they hear, okay? Then there are the people who make claims who know are false. And then there are people who make claims who have, which are based on the literature. So you have three different categories of people. Now, the people who make claims but who know that the claims are false, I put them in the category of being immoral, okay?
Yeah.
But the people who make claims but don't know any better, okay, they should, but maybe they'll get to it one day. And then there are the people, there are scientists who have actually wrote papers and studied the data. Now, there are different kinds of scientists there. There are scientists who have actually carefully studied the issues and written papers, and there is other scientists who supposedly have carefully studied the issues and written papers. And I've looked into both kinds, both types of scientists. And so based on what my own readings, I've gone with the people who claim that there is no such thing as, well, now they call it climate change, they also call it global warming. And that's not going to change some scientists' opinions. I just want to make clear that even though it's a scientific issue, you have scientists who are on different sides of that issue.
Mm-hmm. Right, right.
Now, there's this congressman. Can I tell you about the
Oh, sure,
congressman?
sure.
So I went to a talk at a local college in the Hartford area, and this congressman, U.S. congressman, was going to introduce a guy who was a businessman who used to be involved in wind turbines, okay, supposedly getting energy from wind turbines, and then switched to prospecting for methane, okay. Now, this congressman, before he introduced the congressman also demonized carbon dioxide. Now, that raised my concern because he's introducing a guy who's involved in trying to find sources of methane. Now, if you go to an elementary chemistry book and you see what happens when you burn methane, okay, you get oxygen, you get methane. What comes off? Well, one of the things that comes off is water. The other thing that comes off is carbon dioxide. So I went up to the congressman afterwards because there were only a few questions that were put in. And I said, what would happen if you got rid of all the carbon dioxide on Earth? He didn't know. So I said, what would happen is that you'd kill the plants, and the animals depend on plants in part. You kill the animals, you kill human beings. His reply to me was, so I see you don't believe in global warming. And I said, well, I don't see any evidence for global warming. He says, what about the melting of the glaciers? And I replied, well, that's melting of glaciers. And I saw there was really no point in me trying to continue because this guy didn't seem to understand some elementary ideas. You know, they show sometimes on TV the front of the glacier, which falls into the ocean. It's called calving, and that happens with glaciers. And there was one guy, a Japanese guy, who was involved in the Arctic area, and he says this is the spring thaw, and he says the newspapers want you to believe that this is global warming. What it's natural is what happens, you know. So so that's basically a little bit about my background.
Right, right. Now I noted that you mentioned Ross McKittrick, and he was one of the two Canadian statisticians who disproved the hockey stick. Not long after it was published in the 2001 IPCC reports, and he was a junior scientist, and immediately he gets fame because he's predicting rapid global warming based on some proxy data.
He's actually
Yeah.
an economist. He's actually
Yeah.
he's written about economics and global warming, and who was the guy? The guy who worked with him was a mining specialist,
Okay, right,
and
right.
he got on to looking at the data because he had found something like that when people would make exorbitant claims about how great the deposits are in mining.
Right, right, yeah. Yeah, you know, in many cases we're talking about a real world example of playing telephone. You know, so you have the data that actually comes out from a scientist, and then it's filtered through the media and ends up totally distorted. You know, one of them was that the survey that was done by John Cook in Australia, it wasn't a scientist, but he was pro anthropogenic global warming, and he came up with a figure of 97% of scientists believe this. Well, that like opened up a can of worms for anybody else to then fill in whatever they thought the 97% believed. But the only thing that the 97% believed was that the temperature had warmed some at the end of the 20th century, and that man had something to do with it. Well, then the question is, well, how much did it warm? How much did man have to do with it? But when they drilled down, as David Legates did, you know, he analyzed the 12,000 papers upon which that 97% figure was derived, discovered that it was less than 1% believed of those 12,000, less than 1% of those 12,000 believed that man was responsible for 50% or more of the warming. Less than 1%.
Yeah, so that's an example of manipulating data. Okay, you don't give all the data, so people get an understanding only of what you give them.
Right,
And
right.
and if you give them what you want to give them, then they get what you want them.
Yeah, yeah. I was intrigued by this paper that you did that you dedicated to Fred Singer, this Festschrift, which is a German word for a memorial volume, usually done for somebody whether they're alive or they passed away.
Celebration. Yeah.
Celebration of their life and their work, and it deals with scientific honesty. And I wonder if you could elaborate a bit about that.
Yeah, well, it's part of what, the things that I was saying is the different classifications of people who are presenting certain ideas, dangerous global warming, but who know better. Now, part of it, what's interesting is what causes them to hold this belief. And it's very difficult to know motivations, I find. But there is an enormous amount of money that has gone into supporting papers that are sort of pro-global warming. I once gave a talk at my my town council about global warming, and I showed them all the problems about the claims. And at the end, one of the members of town council suggested that, well, we don't know how much money you're being paid by the oil interests, okay? And I laughed and I said, you know, people make these comments, but unfortunately, no one ever asks me how much money I'm being paid by the government to do X or to do Y. And I know two economists, one from Trinity College, another from the West Coast, and they wrote a paper which was in the Independent Review showing the huge amount of money that has been spent by the United States, just the United States federal government over the years, basically supporting global warming. You don't have to, you don't have to give a lot of money to say I'm giving the money to support global warming. All you have to do is give money to people who write about supporting global warming.
Yeah, yeah. It's a real problem. In fact, I just heard on the news the other day that there are very large foundations that are giving money to the AP to push the global warming agenda.
AP,
Yeah, the AP, Associated Press. Right. It's bad enough that there's always this habit of the press of wanting to highlight scary scenarios, as Stephen Schneider referred to it back many years ago. He says, we have to, this was a scientist, he said, we have to gin up scary scenarios to get the public involved, you know.
Yeah, that's a double-edged sword, because when the public finds out that they've been lied to, then the guys who make statements, even if they turn out to be true, the public might have a question mark. Well, is this guy lying to me again? And I think that the situation about global warming is that it seems to be on the way out. And the reason I think it seems to be on the way out is now people have been hurt in considerable areas around the world, including the UK, okay, and in Germany. So the politicians are pushing one thing, and they have policies. Now the policies affect the people, and if the people get hurt as a result of the policies, then they say, you better change your tune, politicians.
Right.
So that seems to be what I've seen in the Global Warming Policy Foundation. The other thing is that there's something called the CO2 Coalition. CO2coalition.org is their website. And they have been promoting carbon dioxide. Why? Because it's good for plants. It's good for agriculture.
Right.
It's good for the greening of the earth. So it's that combination of, well, CO2 is good, it's not bad, plus people have been hurt, that I think is resulting in this so-called global warming or climate change scare decreasing.
Right. Now, one of the incidents that I noticed back in 1988 was when Al Gore was holding hearings on global warming, and he had James Hansen from NASA testify. And the night before, or whatever, they arranged to turn off the air conditioning on a hot, probably July day, one of the hottest days in DC, and they opened the windows so that it would be stifling inside the hearing room. And the press are suffering, and James Hansen is wiping his brow, you know, talking about climate change. You talk about manipulative, you know. Now, scientists wouldn't countenance that. A real scientist wouldn't allow that. But that's the kind of thing that they do, and that's not the only example.
Well, actually, there's an interview with Wirth where Wirth admits doing this.
Yeah, right.
He says he's going to admit doing it, and the interview is available.
Okay. Did he apologize?
I don't recall the. I think he says I admit doing this. Basically, He said I don't recall the rest of the interview, but I remember that because you mentioned it.
Yeah, and it's illustrative, the fact that, you know, we went through a global cooling phase from the end of World War II until the late 70s. And this is basically 10 years in which the temperature started to rise gradually. And right away, instead of looking at this as a long-term issue, they're glumming on to a short-term phenomenon and then trying to make political hay out of it. It's just bizarre, because these things are, as you know very well, they're subject to cycles that go on for thousands of years. You know, there's, in fact, I just noted a few of them. You know, there's, for our viewers, there have been 600 cycles over the past 1 million years. There's an elliptical orbit, because the Earth is in an elliptical orbit. That's a 100,000 year cycle. There's an axial tilt cycle that's a 41,000 year cycle. There's a precession wobble cycle, which is 23,000 years. And then, as Fred Singer points out in his book, there's a solar-driven cycle, which is a 1,500-year cycle. So all of these overlapping cycles are affecting our climate, which makes the whole issue so complex, you know?
Yeah.
And they want to distill it down to carbon dioxide. And let me add one other point. I observed on YouTube a town meeting in Connecticut where Senator Chris Murphy was speaking on the subject of climate change. And he looked at the audience and he says, all you need to know about climate change is 410, which at the time was the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now it's about 420. 410. He just wanted you to understand that it's just this simple calculation. All you need to know is 410, and you know, and that's what a politician would do, you know, to confuse the public.
Yeah, well, the thing is, it's a scientific issue, and therefore, one has to know what goes into climate change. Does carbon dioxide go into it? Yes, but a small amount.
Mm-hmm.
But the amount of carbon dioxide, I'd like to relate it by using the football stadium. If 100,000 people are in a football stadium, and each person represents a molecule in the atmosphere, of course there are a lot more molecules, but let's just say for this example, 100,000 people, each person represents a molecule. How many people represent all the carbon dioxide? And the answer is 40. 40 out of 100,000, that's about 0.04%. Of that, and it's 0.04% of the atmosphere. Now, that's 40 total carbon dioxide, but most of the carbon dioxide is put out is from natural causes, not human. Right. So how many put out by humans? And the answer is about 1. So yeah. 1 out of 100,000 people represent the human contribution to carbon dioxide. And the CO2 Coalition points out that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now is rather low. If you look back, as you were mentioning, over longer terms, hundreds of thousands of years ago, millions of years ago, the amount of carbon dioxide was 10 times or 15 times more than now. But you also have the sea level rise. You have what's called the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, the Pacific decadal oscillation. And if you want to know what's happening to the climate, you have to be an expert on all of these things.
Right.
And there isn't anyone that I know of who is an expert on all of these things, on sea levels, on gases in the atmosphere, on what happens to the oceans during El Nino, La Nina, El Nino.
Right.
And so, strictly speaking, there's no one who's really an expert on climate change, because to be an expert on climate change, you have to be an expert in all these areas.
Mm-hmm.
So I would not call myself an expert on climate change. All I would call myself is someone who's trying to understand what's going on.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it is a very complex topic. One of the things I had discussed with you was the work of a Danish scientist by the name of Henrik Svensmark. In fact, I brought a copy of his book, The Chilling Stars. And he's done a lot of research on the effect of cosmic rays on cloud cover. And it's very likely, I want to get your comment about it, it's very likely that the effect of the cosmic rays is greater than that of CO2, and that it's affecting cloud cover. And cloud cover is important because when clouds reflect sunlight back into space, it cools the Earth. But if there are fewer clouds, then obviously you get a warmer Earth. And that's one of the chief problems that affects the climate models, these computer models that have been created by, I don't know, about 80 institutions. And they have great difficulty in dealing with the effect of clouds in their climate models. It's one of the great problems with the models themselves, and I wonder if you'd comment about that.
Well, I've seen some interviews with Svensmark, and so I know some of his ideas. And there was a symmetry festival in Delft some years ago, and he was supposed to attend, but he couldn't attend. So he interacted with me, and he asked me if I would give his PowerPoint presentation, which I did.
Oh.
And the sun puts out radiation, and it fluctuates over 11-year cycles and over longer periods. And so there's solar maxima, solar minima, solar maxima, roughly 11 years, and there are also longer periods. But Svensmark is not looking at the sun to try and explain the cloud cover. He's looking at the cosmic ray connection.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens as follows. You have the solar system, and you have the Milky Way galaxy. The Milky Way galaxy has these arms. You can think of them as 4 arms. And the sun is affected by these arms as time passes. And there are cosmic rays that enter our solar system. Now, if the sun is active, then the cosmic rays get sort of blown away.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that's significant is because these particles seed for cloud formation.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have an active sun, there is an effect on the Earth, but it's a cosmic origin.
Right.
And so I'm not that familiar with Svensmark's work, but this is what I gathered from watching some of his
Mm-hmm.
talks.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's another thing about clouds. There's a guy by the name of Patrick Frank, who I understand has recently retired, and he's written a paper which shows the uncertainty in the clouds on the surface of the Earth. Now, if you have low-lying clouds, then they tend to be cooling. Now, if you have uncertainty, and as you were saying, they can't bring clouds into their models, then things are even worse, in terms of accounting for climate change.
Right. Right. Speaking of bureaucrats or politicians and how their understanding of climate issues, I found it very interesting once. I watched a hearing in which Gina McCarthy, the former head of the EPA, was testifying, and a congressman, I can't remember which one it was, asked her what the parts per million of CO2 was, and she didn't know. And here she's head of the EPA, and so she said, Congressman, I'll have to get that calculation for you. Now, that's not a calculation. It's a number. It's a fixed number that you should know. It comes from Mauna Loa in Hawaii. They measure the parts per million of CO2 and have for years. And you'd think that somebody running the EPA would know that figure, but I found that very interesting.
Well, I'm wondering whether she actually has an understanding of the science, or whether she's simply giving what other politicians want her to give in terms of how she acts regarding climate change. I was one of the co-signers on a letter to the EPA requesting that they pay more attention to the evidence, and I think I got back, along with other people who sent in a standard letter. Thank you for your letter. We will consider it. I don't know whether they have or not.
Mm-hmm. Another issue that drives climate alarmism is this idea of sea level rise. And one scientist that I have followed is Nils Axel Morner, who's a Swede.
Yeah.
And he's probably, more than any scientist in the world, has gone around the world to measure sea levels. And, basically, to summarize, his conclusion is that sea levels have been rising at about the same rate per century since the end of the last ice age.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
the sea levels were very low right at the end of the last ice age because all the water was in ice.
Right, yeah.
So, and then when the ice started to melt, the sea levels rose. I forget the number, something like 400 feet. And now there's another problem about sea level. I had a friend who studied sea level and went around looking at the sea level gauges, and he points out that the sea level in many places was just rising linearly, but carbon dioxide was rising exponentially. So one would wonder, well, why is it that the carbon dioxide has a different function that's rising? It rises steeper than sea level. And there's another problem with sea level rise, is that there are places where the bottom level of the ocean is unstable, and that could affect the sea level. It's sort of like if you threw bricks in the bathtub, with the water in it, the water would rise. And so when one talks about sea level rise, you have to be a lot more specific. You have to say, where am I talking about the sea level rise, and what is the underlying structure, and is it contributing to sea level rise?
Right, right. Yeah, and how do you come up with a global figure when you've got different geology in different parts of the world? That's right.
Well, that's another interesting question, global figures. Now, the way they get the temperature rise is they take some averages.
Right.
And I was wondering one day if in my neighborhood, if the average income was, say, $60,000, what does that tell you about me? Well, it doesn't tell you anything about me, particularly if I'm out of work, because an average simply averages me as a zero, so there's a question about averages versus specifics, and in some cases, an average is very valuable because it tells you sort of what the trend might be, but when you're dealing with sea level, it's problematical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And then the monitoring stations are placed very unevenly around the world. There's not as much coverage over the oceans. You deal with the urban heat island effect, where you get stations that were set up that may have been in a suburban area that are now urbanized, and there's asphalt, and it creates a heating effect. So it's very problematic.
Yeah, if you had, at one time in farmland, you had a monitoring device which would get the temperature, the local temperature, and the humidity. And then over time, the farmland has been submerged because the city has grown out there. And the city puts out heat. So then what you have to do is you have to be very careful about subtracting all of the heat from the city in your temperature readings.
Right, right.
And that's not done sufficiently.
Yeah, yeah. Now, the temperature rise since 1900, according to the IPCC, is roughly, it's 1.3 degrees Celsius. So, and this comes at the end of the Little Ice Age, which ended roughly 1850, when the temperature or thermometer record begins. Before that, we were dealing with proxy data before 1850.
Yep.
Is that right? Yeah. And so one of the things that Stephen Koonin, this is a physicist who teaches at NYU, has been writing about in his book that's called Unsettled, was, well, what happened during the period from 1900 to 2023? what has happened to in terms of human flourishing. And he provides some very interesting statistics, and I'll just share some of them with you. For instance, he's got the global temperature went up 1.3 degrees over that period, 1900 to date. Population went up 5 times. Life expectancy went up 130%, from 32 years to 72 years. Literacy went up 4 times, from 21% to 86%. GDP per capita went up 7 times, from let's see, it went from $2,011 to $15,212. Food production was 34% greater. Extreme poverty was 7 times smaller, and the weather death rate per million is 50 times smaller. 50 times smaller. It went from 241 per million to 5 per million from extreme weather. It's just amazing. And so his perspective on that is that if the temperatures were to increase another 1.3 degrees, which is somewhat in line with what the IPC is predicting, we're probably going to see additional human flourishing.
If one would take that.
Yeah. And not only that, but of course, trying to predict temperatures in 2100 is a very problematic proposition anyway, to try to guess, because we may be suffering from cycles, responding to cycles that I've talked about. And also, another thing, and I'd like you to comment on this, is that aren't we overdue for another ice age?
Well, the ice ages over the last couple of million years have been about once every 100,000 years. There was a time when there weren't ice ages. And in between ice ages, it's about 10,000 years, okay? So we happen to have lucked out, okay?
Yeah.
We are in the interim between ice ages. When the next ice age is going to start, I don't know. I haven't studied that sufficiently.
Right. But from what I've read, we're overdue. In other words, in terms of the historical record, so we may be worrying about the wrong thing,
Well, even as you pointed out earlier, we could be in a cycle in temperatures, and there's also the average, and there's also how you take your data. So if you take your data during times when the temperature is increasing, but you ignore the fact that the temperature has decreased and increased and decreased, then you get a result which isn't characteristic of the long-term results.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, we hear a lot of talk about achieving net zero in terms of carbon dioxide. What's your reaction to that?
Well, if net zero means zero carbon dioxide, what the CO2 coalition has pointed out is that that will wipe out a lot of agriculture. Because plants, I haven't mentioned this before, plants have an underside, they have holes which are called stomata. And these holes open to let carbon dioxide go in. And the plant leaves then use the carbon dioxide to produce biological meat, so to speak, that humans take into their diet. So net zero is the worst possible idea in terms of benefiting human beings. It actually never occurred to me before your question now what net zero meant. It didn't occur to me what net zero meant. Now I understand.
Right.
And it's a really bad idea. And so the CO2 coalition has pointed out that without carbon dioxide, you're going to have huge agricultural problems. And plants also need water. So if you have if you have less water, then the plants have to take in more carbon dioxide. So I'm not a person who has made a study of plants, but some of the things that I've read, I've just related to you.
Right, right. Now, you're probably familiar with the Danish statistician Bjorn Lomborg, who has this Copenhagen consensus in which he and assembled statisticians, economists, and so forth have tried to rank the greatest problems in the world where we can direct our resources. You know, for instance, at the top of the list would be things like HIV prevention, malaria in particular in countries like Africa. Global warming comes down near the bottom of the list in terms of expenditure. And one of the calculations or figures he gives is that if we spent $100 trillion, like some people promoting the Green New Deal would like to do, not only would it bankrupt the United States, but it would reduce the temperature of the Earth by a grand total of 0.3 of 1 degree for $100 trillion. And this is a guy who studied it, not just himself, but a whole team of people in the Copenhagen consensus. You know, so.
Well, that's an interesting figure because it reminds me of a slide that I saw from Richard Lindzen, where he's showing what the temperature variation is in Boston over a period of a month. This was of some years ago, and temperatures maybe 10 degrees or so, and then he superimposes on that the variation in the temperature on the Earth with the averages, and what you see is a very thin red line. Okay, so the claim is, well, if you have these averages, which globally, which are so small, but the variation at a particular region like Boston. By the way, the same thing as it happens in Hartford. I see the temperature varies 5, 10, 15 degrees during one day. Mm-hmm. So why should I care about the average over the globe when I know that in Hartford what the temperature variation is, and I know what the effects will be?
Right, right. You know, that same thought came to me because I said, well, now what is the average annual temperature of Connecticut? And the National Oceanographic Institute tracks these things, and their figures are, for Connecticut, it's 49 degrees, this is in Fahrenheit, 49 degrees. In New Jersey, it's 52.7. So if temperatures were to increase 1.5 degrees, it would be less than the difference between Connecticut and New Jersey. And they're trying to call this an existential threat. Okay, would we all be dropping like flies if we lived in New Jersey? What about in Virginia? Virginia, it's 55.1 degrees. Georgia's 63.5. And if you retire to Florida, which millions of people are doing, it's 70.7 degrees average in Florida. So that's basically 21.7 degrees warmer than Connecticut. But are people dropping like flies? No, they use air conditioning, you know.
Yeah, so you can look at the temperature variations, and then you can see, as you pointed out, how people are living, and the standard of living of human beings is going up.
Right.
And it goes up. My grandfather used to complain, this was many decades ago, about the price of milk. He said years before that, the price of milk was less. But a recent set of economics indicates that the way to actually judge the economy is how many hours of work you're putting in to get a particular item. So I didn't ask my grandfather, because I didn't know at the time, how many hours of work did you have to put in to get a quart of milk 10 years before you told me that the price of milk is too high. So it's not looking at the price of milk or the price of any item that's important. There's a book, it's called, I think, Superabundance, but you have to look at how many hours of work it it takes to get that item, because time is what we are concerned about. We have finite lives, so
Right. Yeah.
it's a reasonable figure to look at.
Yeah. Now, we reconnected at a recent Yankee Institute meeting in Hartford where they were talking about the Connecticut economy and also about this proposal to ban the sale and production of gas-powered vehicles by 2035. And I was ready to get up and talk, and so I saw Larry. I said, "Oh, that's Larry," and we both made comments about the foolhardiness of doing that. And fortunately, they pulled it, because what happens is that it was in charge of DEEP, the Department of Environmental Protection in Connecticut. Then they promulgated regulations, but unlike the federal government, they have a legislative committee that then evaluates those regulations before they recommend sending them to the full General Assembly. And that committee, fortunately, consists of an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. And they got a lot of feedback, and as a result, they voted against it, and the governor pulled the regulations. So we escaped on that score, but they're going to go back to the drawing board, so I'm still suspicious of what they might try to do. But there's no basis for this at all. Or they're trying to copy what California is doing. But maybe you'd like to comment about
yeah,
that.
The cost of electric vehicles is pretty high compared to what you can get from gasoline powered cars. And number one, there's no reason to do this based on global warming, because global warming is on its way out. And number two, if people want to buy gasoline-powered cars, new ones, and they're forbidden from doing that, then they'd have to spend a lot of money to get electric-powered or partly electric-powered cars. And some people are poorer than other people, so trying to give the poorer people extra money so they can buy these cars, well, the money has to come from somewhere. And from what little I know of economics, if you print money, you're going to cause inflation. And if you take money from people who have it and give it to people who don't have it, then what kind of justice are you doing to those people that you take the money from?
Right.
So those are a couple of problems in it. Maybe now that people are suffering in different places as a result of policies put in by politicians who believe that climate change exists. Maybe they will pay more attention to the science.
Right. I hope so. I know I wrote letters to all the Democrat members. Figure I'd target my efforts there. To try to explain the science. But it seemed to work. So there was some common sense that creeped through. Now, what do you make of the climate or temperature record of the 20th century that doesn't appear to support this alarmism at all, and this narrative about global warming? Because in the first part of the 20th century, you had warming. We had some of the hottest years in the 1930s, the Dust Bowl era. And then we had a global cooling period from 1945 to like 1978. And then we started on a slow warming period. So the period before World War II, of course, CO2 wasn't a factor, but yet temperatures went up. And then when CO2 started to go up after World War II, temperatures went down. So it contradicted the theory there. And it's only in the period from 1978 to the present where you could say there's a correspondence between temperature rise and CO2. But that's just a coincidence. Doesn't prove anything.
Right.
So,
one would have to look at all of the components that could affect temperature, namely what's happening with the oceans, what's happening with the atmosphere, the clouds, and if I'm a scientist, and science requires that its members, its practitioners, have integrity and be honest. If you had someone who was doing research for cancer and put phony drugs in, and people were dying from cancer, then the cause of that is a lack of honesty of the individual researcher. So I think in any kind of research, any kind of scientific research, you have to be honest and have integrity about what you find out. If you say that if I stroke the paper and I let it go, it's going to hang in midair, but it didn't do that, then what that says is that even if I have a theory about if I stroke the paper, what's going to happen, and it doesn't happen, I have to actually take that into account, and I have to revise the theory or throw out the theory. Otherwise, I'm being dishonest.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the issues that doesn't come up enough, I mean, there are people in the global warming alarmist camp that want to make the case that poor people around the earth are going to be harmed by climate change. But the opposite is the case. If we were to ban fossil fuels, it's the poorest of the poor who are going to suffer the most. And I've seen estimates, in fact, a lot of these are discussed in Alex Epstein's book, Fossil Future, which I recommend to everyone. If you want to know what the impact of pursuing this foolhardy agenda would be, it's outlined in detail by Fossil Future. And by the way, Epstein is not a climate scientist, but he's become an energy expert. But his basic training was as a philosopher. So he combines philosophy and a sense of understanding how the vulnerable populations around the world will suffer. And I've seen one estimate that if we abandon fossil fuels, in Africa alone, 1.4 billion people would die. Of the 8 billion people on the earth, 1.4 would die. And it could be 2.5, let's say, around the world, if you added in India, China, other poor countries that don't have any energy resilience. People who have not enough power. In fact, there are like 1.5 billion people that only have enough power to power a refrigerator. And so people in Africa cook with biofuels. They cook with wood and dung. And as a result, 2 million people a year die from the pollutants that they're breathing from that. And so people haven't contemplated, as Epstein does, the tremendous dangers to the populations of the world if we abandon fossil fuels and don't use these fuels, because they're not going to start building solar windmills. They're not going to start installing them, or solar panels on their huts. Let's face it. So
yeah, the problem with solar panels and wind turbines is the amount of energy per unit area. So fossil fuels, oil, gas, you can have in a relatively small region, and you can support the electrical needs of the city. But if you want comparable energy supplies from solar and wind, you have to use a lot more land, actually land for building the wind turbines, land for supplying the solar panels. And then there are also problems associated with that. Number one, the wind doesn't always blow, and it doesn't blow strongly enough. And the sun doesn't always shine. If you look, I think about 60% of the year the Earth is covered with clouds. So how people are going to get electricity if you replace fossil fuels with wind and with solar, there are other problems too. The wind turbines kill birds. They kill bats. Bats go in toward the turbine, and there's a relative vacuum, so their lungs get sort of depleted of oxygen. Also, birds get killed. So I don't know. It never made sense to me how you're going to support the electrical needs of people by means of wind and turbine. Say, well, what about batteries? Now, there was this guy who was a geophysicist in southern Australia, and he's been talking, criticizing these climate change ideas, but there's been some discussion about the batteries, and I did my own calculation. If you had a battery which was a huge battery or bank of batteries to supply southern Australia, if the electricity goes out from the fossil fuels, then how long would the batteries be on to take the load? Because the cities are dark.
Mm-hmm.
And I calculated around 5 minutes, which was in the neighborhood of something that I read, which was about 5-7 minutes, okay?
Right.
And then I ran into a problem, because then I was wondering, okay, so the lights go on for 5 or 7 minutes, and then what happens? Then they go out again. And unless, of course, you have some new batteries that come into place. And I don't know where the new batteries are coming from, or how you can charge the batteries that have just exhausted their supply of energy.
Right. Well, one final thought I'd like to make, and that is, in fact, I just checked again this morning. There are surveys that have been done about young people and how they're afraid of climate change. It's very sad. It's one of the saddest things that has been an outgrowth of this extreme promotion of this idea. And it's like 60% of young people are afraid. A lot of them some have contemplated committing suicide. Others don't want to have families. They don't want to bring children into the world. This is a far greater threat than any potential threat of climate change. And they need to get this out of their head. There is no existential threat, no matter how much AOC says. But the other thing is that we right now we face a demographic threat. The fact that birth rates around the world are going down, even in undeveloped countries, but in the Western world they're going down. And if they continue on this, and it's propelled by this concern about climate change, talking about Europe, it threatens the whole social welfare system. It won't be able to be supported. So what about all the people on the left, the liberals, who would normally support a social safety net, as I would, but that whole thing will collapse because the demographic trends that are already headed downward and would be exacerbated by young people not having children.
Well, I am happy to say that I have taught 3 courses at my university on climate change, but not what's wrong with climate change or what's right with it, but what do you think about it? And so I had the students watch Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, and also a counter movie which is called The Great Global Warming Scam, or it's a film which has scientists in it. Gore's film has mostly gore in it, but this film has mostly scientists in it who are commenting, critiquing global warming. Now, I know that some of my students, when I was teaching the course, some of the students said, "We want to know what you think." And I said, "I'm not telling you." Now, the student could have gone on my website and found out, but I lucked out. The student didn't do that. So, and I also got some good feedback from a communication professor, actually, who told me that she has some students who took your course. The course is one of a number of courses that are given, all different topics, to freshmen. They have to take it when they come in. I don't know whether you took it when you did, okay. And they need people teaching from the different departments. So I was happy to volunteer.
Well, that's great. Well, you're one of those rare academics, Larry, who doesn't give his opinion. Another I think of is Alan Dershowitz, who said in 40 years of teaching law at Harvard, he never told his students his opinions.
Well, it's not easy to do, I'll tell you. It's not easy to do, because I asked myself, now, if I'm going to present this view, does that indicate that I'm telling students of my view? And so I have to investigate that before I did.
Right, right. Well, I want to thank you, Larry, for sharing your knowledge with us. It's great experience, and I'm sure our viewers will get a lot out of this, and hopefully they'll understand that get on with your life. You know, climate is not going to threaten you. We'll have some we'll have ups and downs, but it's not an existential threat by any means, and we need to enjoy life. And I thank you for that. Okay.
Thank you.